7 men controlled more wealth than 15 African nations combined. By 1902, they owned 90% of the world's diamond supply and 40% of its gold production. Their combined fortune exceeded $300 billion in today's money. Yet most people have never heard their names. But what nobody knows is how they rewrote international law, started wars, and created the template for modern corporate monopolies. They didn't just extract minerals. They engineered an entire economic system designed to funnel wealth from one continent to another. The British Empire didn't conquer South Africa through military might alone. It used 7 businessmen who transformed raw ambition into a machine that extracted $1.5 trillion worth of resources over 4 decades. This is the story of the Randlords. They ended up controlling the economic destiny of an entire continent. But in 1867, most of them were nobody. Cecil Rhodes was a sickly 18-year-old sent to Africa because doctors thought the climate might cure his tuberculosis. Barney Barnato was a failed London boxer turned street performer juggling in East End pubs. Alfred Beit was a clerk in a Hamburg diamond firm earning barely enough to eat. Julius Werner counted inventory in a Frankfurt warehouse. The gap between where they started and where they ended up defies normal business logic. What made them different wasn't luck or timing. It was their willingness to operate in ways established businessmen wouldn't consider. They understood something fundamental. Whoever controlled the minerals controlled the future. And in 1867, South Africa's mineral wealth was completely unregulated, unguarded, and edible to anyone ruthless enough to take it. Behind the mansions and titles was a system built on 3 principles: consolidate all competition, control labor costs, and capture government regulation before it can limit your operations. The Orange River sparkled when Erasmus Jacobs noticed something unusual. He was 15 years old, watching sheep on his family's farm near Hopetown. The year was 1866. The pebble caught light differently than normal river stones. Harder, clearer. He pocketed it and brought it home. His mother used it as a toy for his younger siblings. For months, it sat in their farmhouse, holding down papers, tossed around by children who had no idea what they were playing with. John O'Reilly, a traveling merchant, visited the farm in early 1867. He saw the stone and recognized what the Jacobs family didn't. He asked if he could borrow it for examination. Mrs. Jacobs handed it over. "You can keep it if you want," she said. That pebble was a 21-25-carat diamond worth over $2,500, equivalent to $50,000 today. O'Reilly sent it to mineralogists in Grahamstown who confirmed its authenticity. News spread slowly at first, then explosively. By April 1867, fortune seekers were flooding into the region. Within a year, 10,000 prospectors had descended on Kimberley and the surrounding areas. They came from England, Germany, America, Australia. Some had mining experience, most didn't. What they found transformed everything. The diamonds weren't just in riverbeds. They were embedded in volcanic pipes called kimberlite, concentrated in ways geologists had never seen. One pipe near a farm owned by the De Beers brothers contained more diamonds than all previously known deposits combined. The problem was simple. Thousands of individual diggers couldn't efficiently extract diamonds from deep underground. River panning worked fine. Industrial mining required capital, machinery, and organization that individual prospectors didn't have. You see, the early diamond rush was chaos. Each digger owned a tiny claim, typically 31 square feet. Imagine a massive open-pit mine divided into thousands of individual plots, each worked by different people with different equipment and different expertise. Claims were bought, sold, traded, and fought over daily. This is where the future Randlords saw their opportunity. They didn't arrive looking for diamonds. They arrived looking for claims to consolidate. While thousands of diggers dug, they bought. While prospectors celebrated small finds, they calculated long-term control. While others focused on today's profits, they planned decade-long strategies. Cecil Rhodes arrived in Kimberley in 1871. He was 18 years old and dying from tuberculosis. His brother already had diamond claims. Rhodes didn't dig. He started buying neighboring claims one by one, paying slightly more than they were worth to diggers who needed cash immediately. Barney Barnato arrived the same year with £40 in his pocket and a trunk full of fake cigars he planned to sell. Within months, he realized the real money wasn't in finding diamonds. It was in controlling the diggers who did. The race was on. Not to find minerals, but to monopolize them. George Harrison was broke when he found the richest gold reef in human history. The year was 1886. Harrison was an Australian prospector who'd spent a decade chasing mineral strikes across southern Africa. He'd found nothing. His equipment was worn out. His savings were gone. He was working as a handyman on a farm in the Witwatersrand, a rocky ridge 40 miles south of Pretoria. One morning in February, Harrison was repairing a fence when he noticed gold-bearing rock exposed in an outcrop. He chipped off samples and confirmed what he suspected. This wasn't just gold. This was a reef that ran horizontally underground, potentially for miles. He filed a claim. Within weeks, he sold it for £10 and disappeared from history. Nobody knows where George Harrison went or what happened to him. But the reef he discovered would produce 40% of all gold ever mined on Earth. The Witwatersrand gold fields, the Rand, operated on completely different principles than diamond mining. Diamond pipes were vertical deposits concentrated in specific locations. The Rand's gold ran in thin horizontal layers called reefs, buried thousands of feet underground, extending for over 300 miles. You couldn't pan for this gold. You couldn't pick it up. Extracting it required industrial-scale deep mining with expensive machinery, chemical processing plants, and massive labor forces. Individual prospectors were useless here. This was a millionaire's game from day one. Word reached Kimberley fast. The Randlords, who'd been fighting over diamond monopolies, suddenly realized gold dwarfed everything. The total value of all diamonds ever found was maybe $50 billion. Early geological surveys suggested the Rand contained $3 trillion in gold reserves. Here's what's interesting. The Transvaal government, the Boer Republic that controlled the Rand, had no idea how to regulate industrial gold mining. President Paul Kruger was a farmer who'd fought the British for independence. His government was designed to support agriculture, not manage global finance. The Randlords descended on Johannesburg like hawks on wounded prey. Cecil Rhodes sent agents to buy up mining claims before prices exploded. Alfred Beit and Julius Verneer, who'd built their fortune consolidating diamond mines, immediately began applying the same strategy to gold. Barney Barnato, Rhodes's main rival in Kimberley, arrived with millions in capital ready to invest. But they faced a problem. Unlike Kimberley, where British colonial authorities eventually supported monopolistic consolidation, the Transvaal government was suspicious of foreign capitalists. President Kruger understood that these British mining magnates wanted more than gold. They wanted political control. Kruger implemented regulations designed to limit foreign influence. Mining companies had to employ Boer supervisors. Dynamite could only be purchased from a government-controlled monopoly that charged inflated prices. Foreign miners couldn't vote in local elections. Railways and telegraph lines were controlled by the state. The Randlords viewed these regulations as obstacles to eliminate. What most people miss is that the conflict between the Randlords and the Transvaal government wasn't about fairness or rights. It was about who would control the wealth generated by African gold, mined by African labor on African land. The Boers wanted to maintain sovereignty over their republic. The Randlords wanted unrestricted access to resources and profits. Between 1886 and 1890, over 100,000 people flooded into Johannesburg. A town that didn't exist in 1885 became the largest city in southern Africa within 5 years. Tent cities sprawled for miles. Saloons, brothels, and stock exchanges operated side by side. The gold itself was difficult to process. Rand gold ore was low-grade, mixed with other minerals, requiring complex chemical extraction. The MacArthur Forest cyanide process, patented in 1887, made it economically viable to process low-grade ore by dissolving gold in cyanide solution. The Randlords bought patents, built processing plants, and standardized extraction techniques across their mines. They imported engineers from California and Australia who'd worked in other gold rushes. They created training programs for specialized mining roles. Most importantly, they integrated vertically. They didn't just mine gold. They owned the dynamite factories, the cyanide plants, the stamp mills, the refineries, and the railways that transported ore. Control every step, and you control the profit margin. By 1890, the Rand was producing over 20% of the world's gold supply. By 1898, it was producing 27%. The Randlords, who controlled the major mining companies, were making profits equivalent to billions annually. But here's the thing. Their profit margins were constrained by two factors. First, Kruger's regulations increased operating costs. Second, labor costs remained unpredictable because skilled miners could demand higher wages. The solution they developed would become the most controversial aspect of their empire. If regulations constrained profits, they'd change the regulations through political pressure. If labor costs were too high, they'd create a system that eliminated workers' ability to negotiate. What happened next transformed South Africa from a collection of independent territories into a unified state designed to serve mining interests. The Randlords didn't just adapt to existing political structures. They demolished them and rebuilt the system from scratch. The stage was set for the largest corporate consolidation in history. Cecil Rhodes stood in his Kimberley office in March 1888, staring at a contract that would make him the richest man in the world. The document consolidated his De Beers mining company with Barney Barnato's competing diamond empire. Together, they would control 90% of global diamond production. The merger was valued at £5.3 million, equivalent to $650 million today. But the real value was incalculable, complete monopoly power over the world's diamond supply. Getting Barnato to sign had taken months of negotiation, threats, financial maneuvering, and psychological warfare. Rhodes and Barnato had been rivals for a decade, each buying up diamond claims, undercutting each other's prices, and fighting for control of Kimberley's 4 major diamond pipes. Rhodes won by offering Barnato something more valuable than money: a seat in the syndicate that would control global prices. Imagine, Rhodes told him, being able to set the price of diamonds worldwide. We don't compete for market share, we become the market. Barnato signed. The De Beers Consolidated Mines Company was born. But Rhodes wasn't finished. Diamond monopolies were lucrative, but his ambitions extended far beyond Kimberley. He wanted to paint the map red, to extend British control from Cape Town to Cairo, creating a continuous chain of British territory running the entire length of Africa. You see, Rhodes understood that mineral wealth and political power were inseparable. Controlling mines meant nothing if governments could regulate your operations, tax your profits, or seize your assets. Real power required controlling the governments themselves. In 1890, Rhodes became Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. He was 37 years old. His election wasn't democratic in any meaningful sense. Voting was restricted to property owners, and Rhodes's mining wealth gave him enormous influence over who qualified to vote and how they cast their ballots. As Prime Minister, Rhodes used his position to advance mining interests while presenting his actions as imperial expansion. He secured British South Africa Company charters that gave him private control over vast territories in what would become Rhodesia, modern Zimbabwe and Zambia. These weren't government colonies. They were corporate possessions. The British South Africa Company operated under a royal charter that granted Rhodes the authority to acquire territory through treaties or force, establish administrative and judicial systems, raise private armies and police forces, grant mining concessions and collect taxes, build railways and telegraph networks. Think about that. A private company owned territory the size of France and Germany combined, with full governmental powers. Rhodes didn't govern on behalf of the Crown. He governed on behalf of his shareholders. Meanwhile, Alfred Beit and Julius Wernher were building their own empire through different methods. Their firm, Wernher, Beit and Company, focused on consolidating Rand gold mines using financial engineering that modern private equity firms would recognize instantly. Their strategy was elegant and ruthless. They'd identify smaller mining companies with valuable claims but insufficient capital to develop them. Then they'd offer partnership deals. We'll provide capital and expertise in exchange for controlling interest. Once they controlled a company, they'd integrate it into their existing operations, eliminate redundant costs, and extract maximum efficiency. Between 1890 and 1895, Wernher, Beit and Company gained controlling interest in 37 major gold mining operations on the Rand. They didn't announce these acquisitions publicly. They operated through a web of subsidiary companies, holding firms, and proxy boards that obscured the extent of their control. Lionel Phillips, who'd arrived in Kimberley as a diamond buyer, became their lead operator in Johannesburg. Phillips understood something crucial. The real bottleneck in Rand mining wasn't finding gold. It was processing capacity and labor management. He standardized mining operations across all Alfred Beit companies. Identical equipment, identical processes, identical labor contracts. This created economies of scale that independent mines couldn't match. A small mining company might pay $50 per ton to process ore. Alfred Beit's integrated operations processed ore for $18 per ton. The cost advantage was insurmountable. Small companies either sold out or went bankrupt. By 1895, 5 companies controlled 80% of Rand gold production. Consolidated Gold Fields, Rhodes, Alfred Beit and Company Barnato Brothers, Barney Barnato, Gold Fields of South Africa, Amalgamated Interests, Rand Mines Limited, later absorbed by others. But here's what made this consolidation different from normal monopolies. These weren't competing companies. The same individuals sat on multiple boards, shared information, coordinated production levels, and collectively controlled gold prices. Rhodes owned shares in Alfred Beit companies. Beit sat on the board of Rhodes's Consolidated Gold Fields. Barnato had partnerships with both. They competed publicly while coordinating privately. This is where modern cartel behavior was invented. They didn't need explicit agreements or written contracts. They simply recognized mutual interest in limiting production to maintain high prices, controlling labor costs through collective wage setting, and presenting a unified front when negotiating with governments. The Transvaal government under President Kruger watched this consolidation with growing alarm. Foreign capitalists were accumulating dangerous levels of economic power. Johannesburg's economy dwarfed Pretoria's. The Uitlanders, foreign residents, mostly British, outnumbered Boer citizens in the Transvaal. Kruger responded with increasingly restrictive regulations. He raised the dynamite monopoly prices, charged higher railway rates for ore transportation, and extended the residency requirement for voting rights from 5 to 14 years. Each regulation reduced the Randlords' profit margins. But more importantly, each regulation reinforced their conviction that Kruger's government needed to be removed. Look, what happened next wasn't inevitable. There were paths to compromise, negotiated settlements, gradual political integration. But compromise wasn't in the Randlords' vocabulary. They'd built their fortunes on total control of diamond supplies, of gold production, of labor systems. Partial political influence wasn't enough. They wanted a government that served mining interests exclusively. And they were willing to manufacture one. The conspiracy they developed would lead directly to war, kill over 70,000 people, and establish the political framework for apartheid. But in 1895, as they gathered in private meetings in Johannesburg and Cape Town, they believed they were simply solving a business problem. Rhodes summed up their thinking in a letter to a fellow Randlord. "We have the wealth, we have the weapons, we have the will. All that remains is execution. The execution would be catastrophic." The meeting took place in December 1895 at a private residence in Cape Town. Present were Cecil Rhodes, Alfred Beit, Lionel Phillips, and several other mining magnates. The topic was simple: how to overthrow President Kruger's government and install a regime friendly to mining interests. They called it reform. The plan was to stage an uprising in Johannesburg using armed Uitlanders, supported by a military force led by Leander Starr Jameson, Rhodes's lieutenant. The raid would coincide with internal protests, creating the appearance of popular revolution. British authorities would reluctantly intervene to restore order. The Transvaal would become a British protectorate with a government the Randlords could control. Rhodes committed £200,000 to finance the operation, equivalent to $25 million today. Beit contributed matching funds. They purchased weapons, recruited mercenaries, and distributed arms to Uitlander conspirators in Johannesburg. The Jameson raid launched on December 29, 1895. 600 mounted troops crossed into Transvaal territory, expecting to link up with thousands of armed rebels in Johannesburg. The raid was a spectacular failure. The promised uprising never materialized. Kruger's forces surrounded Jameson's column and forced their surrender within 4 days. The conspirators were arrested. The plot was exposed. Rhodes was forced to resign as Prime Minister. British authorities publicly condemned the raid while privately sympathizing with its goals. But here's what's interesting. The raid's failure didn't hurt the Randlords economically. It hurt them politically and personally, but their mining operations continued uninterrupted. Stock prices dipped temporarily, then recovered. Gold production increased. Profits remained strong. What the failed raid proved was that direct action wouldn't work. They needed subtler methods. Between 1896 and 1899, the Randlords shifted strategies. Instead of overthrowing Kruger, they'd make his government economically unsustainable. They'd create conditions where British military intervention became inevitable. The tool they used was the mining industry itself. First, they coordinated a campaign emphasizing how Transvaal regulations were strangling the golden goose. They published reports showing how dynamite monopoly prices reduced profitability. They produced studies demonstrating how railway rate increases hurt competitiveness. They gave interviews to British newspapers portraying Kruger as an anti-British tyrant oppressing innocent British subjects. Second, they began lobbying the British government directly. Alfred Beit spent months in London meeting with colonial office officials, members of parliament and financiers. His message was simple. The Transvaal's gold was essential to British economic interests. Kruger's government threatened those interests. British intervention was justified to protect British subjects and British investments. Third, they manufactured a labor crisis to justify their claims about government interference. The Randlords collectively reduced wages for African miners, knowing this would cause labor unrest. When strikes occurred, they blamed Kruger's government for creating unstable business conditions. You see, they understood that controlling the narrative was as important as controlling the mines. Public opinion in Britain needed to believe that war was necessary to protect British interests against Boer aggression. The truth, that mining magnates wanted unrestricted access to resources, was too crude. The story needed heroes and villains. Meanwhile, they continued consolidating control over the mining industry itself. This was the less visible but more important monopoly game. Julius Wernher had moved to London in 1890, establishing Wernher, Beit and Company's headquarters there. This gave them direct access to British financial markets and allowed them to raise capital at lower interest rates than competitors. They used this advantage to systematically buy out smaller mining operations. Their method was predatory but legal. They'd identify a promising but undercapitalized mining company. Then they'd approach the company's bankers and offer to purchase the outstanding debt at a slight premium. Once they owned the debt, they'd call it due. The mining company, unable to pay, would default. Wernher, Beit would acquire the company's assets in bankruptcy proceedings. Between 1896 and 1898, they acquired 23 gold mining operations this way. Total cost, approximately £3 million. Total value of acquired reserves, over £40 million. Barney Barnato pursued a different strategy. He focused on vertical integration, acquiring the industrial infrastructure that all mines needed. He bought dynamite factories, purchasing the Transvaal government's monopoly supplier through intermediary companies. He acquired railway stock, gaining influence over transportation costs. He established banks that provided mining companies with working capital, at favorable rates if they partnered with Barnato, at punishing rates if they competed. By 1898, Barnato controlled approximately 25% of the Rand's gold output directly, and had significant influence over another 30% through debt and infrastructure control. The consolidation created a bizarre situation. The Randlords were publicly complaining about monopoly prices and government interference, while privately operating the most sophisticated monopolistic cartel in existence. Let me put this in perspective. In 1898, the Rand produced 4.3 million ounces of gold. At contemporary prices, that was worth approximately £18 million annually, equivalent to $2.2 billion today. The Randlords controlled over 80% of that production. Their profit margins averaged 35% after all costs. That's $616 million annually in pure profit, controlled by fewer than a dozen men. But here's the thing, they weren't satisfied. A 35% margin on $2.2 billion meant they were losing $1.43 billion to costs, primarily labor, government fees, and transportation. They believed those costs could be slashed if government regulation disappeared and labor rights were eliminated. The solution they envisioned required political control. Not influence, control. They needed a government that would eliminate wage protections for African workers, remove restrictions on working conditions, provide police and military forces to suppress labor unrest, build infrastructure, railways, ports at taxpayer expense, keep taxes minimal on mining profits. The Transvaal government under Kruger would never agree to this. The British government, properly motivated, might. And so the Randlords began preparing for war. Not openly, they had learned from the Jameson raid disaster, but methodically. They increased gold production, knowing that higher output would make the Transvaal seem more valuable and British intervention more justifiable. They expanded their British press campaign, publishing articles about Uitlander grievances and Boer oppression. They met with British military officials, providing detailed maps of Transvaal territory and intelligence about Boer military capabilities. Most importantly, they made it clear to British government officials that they would financially support a military campaign. Rhodes alone pledged £1 million, equivalent to $125 million today. Other Randlords contributed similar amounts. The British government would wage the war, but mining interests would subsidize it. The tragedy is that war wasn't necessary. Kruger's government was willing to negotiate. In 1899, proposals were discussed that would have granted voting rights to Uitlanders, reduced the dynamite monopoly prices, and addressed mining industry concerns through diplomatic channels. But the Randlords rejected compromise. They'd tasted total control in Kimberley's diamond industry. They'd seen how monopoly power translated into unlimited wealth. They wanted the same system replicated in gold. And they understood that creating that system required removing every obstacle, political, legal, and human. In October 1899, tensions between the British Empire and the Transvaal Republic reached breaking point. The Randlords had spent 3 years preparing the ground. British newspapers were unanimous in supporting intervention. British politicians had convinced themselves that war was necessary. The British public believed that brave British subjects were suffering under tyrannical Boer rule. None of it was true. But truth was irrelevant. The machinery of war was in motion, funded by men who measured success in ounces of gold and calculated profits in thousands of African lives. The Second Boer War was about to begin. The war started with artillery fire at dawn on October 11, 1899. But the real war, the one that mattered to the Randlords, was always political, not military. Armies would fight the visible battle. Behind the scenes, mining magnates would fight for the structure of whatever government emerged from the conflict. The British Empire deployed 450,000 troops to South Africa. It was the largest military mobilization in British history at that point. The cost was staggering, £200 million, equivalent to $25 billion today. The human cost was worse. Over 70,000 dead, including 22,000 Boer civilians who died in British concentration camps. The Randlords watched from London and Cape Town, calculating how the war's progress affected their investments. Here's what most people don't understand about the Boer War. It wasn't primarily a territorial conflict. The British Empire already controlled most of southern Africa. This was about who would govern the richest gold fields on Earth. Cecil Rhodes spent the war's first months trapped in Kimberley during the Siege of Kimberley, a Boer encirclement that lasted from October 1899 to February 1900. But even under siege, Rhodes manipulated events. He telegraphed British military commanders, urging them to prioritize relieving Kimberley over other strategic objectives. He used his political connections to ensure that when British forces did break through, they brought favorable news about post-war political arrangements. Alfred Beit and Julius Wernher operated from London, where they had much more direct influence over British policy. They met regularly with Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain, who had significant financial investments in mining companies. The relationship between government policy and mining interests was so intertwined that Chamberlain's department was nicknamed the Department of the Mining Houses. Wernher and Beit had a clear agenda: ensure that post-war governance favored mining operations. They produced detailed memoranda outlining the government structure they wanted: a British High Commissioner with supreme executive authority, no democratic elections that might empower Afrikaners or Africans, mining-friendly tax policies and regulatory frameworks, state-funded infrastructure development, railways, ports, power plants, police forces controlled by mining interests to suppress labor unrest. Look, they weren't subtle about it. In a January 1900 letter to Chamberlain, Beit wrote, "The future of South Africa depends on the gold industry. Everything else is secondary. Government policy must recognize this reality." Chamberlain agreed. His instructions to British military commanders reflected mining priorities: protect the mines, secure the railways, maintain ore processing facilities. Everything else was negotiable. The war's military phase lasted until May 1902, when Boer forces finally surrendered. But the political war began the moment British forces captured Pretoria in June 1900. British authorities immediately established a military government under Lord Alfred Milner, the High Commissioner for Southern Africa. Milner was explicitly pro-mining, believing that British imperial interests and mining profitability were identical. His first actions revealed whose interests he served. Within weeks of taking control, Milner eliminated the dynamite monopoly, reduced railway rates for ore transportation, imported Chinese indentured laborers to reduce wage costs, suspended labor protections for African miners, granted mining companies control over compound housing systems. These weren't random policies. They were items from a wish list the Randlords had provided to British officials years earlier. But Milner faced a problem: the Boer population. The Afrikaners remained hostile to British rule. They'd lost the war militarily but retained numerical superiority in the Transvaal and Orange Free State. If democratic elections were held, they'd elect anti-British governments that might reimpose mining regulations. The solution was to delay democracy indefinitely, while creating political structures that favored mining interests. Between 1902 and 1906, Milner governed the Transvaal as a crown colony without meaningful local representation. He appointed a legislative council composed entirely of British officials and mining executives. Lionel Phillips, representing Werner Beit and Company, held a council seat. Several other Randlords received appointments. This was naked corporate governance of territory. Mining executives literally wrote the laws governing their own operations. They used this power systematically. They passed the Native Labor Regulation Act of 1904, which restricted African workers' mobility and created the legal foundation for the compound system. They established the Chamber of Mines as the official regulatory body for the industry, giving mining companies the authority to police themselves. They restructured tax policy to minimize mining royalties while extracting revenue from African taxpayers through hut taxes and pass fees. You see, the genius of their system was making it appear legitimate. They didn't announce, "We're creating a government to serve mining interests." They framed everything as necessary for economic development, security, and progress. African voices were entirely excluded from these discussions. The approximately 4 million black South Africans, who constituted 80% of the population, had no political representation whatsoever. Their land had been seized, their labor was controlled through pass laws, and their wages were set by mining companies operating as a cartel. The Randlords viewed African workers as interchangeable labor units whose costs needed to be minimized. In internal correspondence, they referred to labor policies using engineering language: optimizing efficiency, reducing operational friction, standardizing inputs. Here's what that meant in practice. African miners worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, underground in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They were housed in compounds, prison-like facilities designed to prevent organizing and limit movement. They were paid approximately 1/10 what white miners received for similar work. They had no legal recourse when injured, no compensation when killed, no rights to negotiate contracts. The system was deliberately designed to be exploitative. It wasn't an unfortunate side effect of mining operations. It was the operating model. Between 1902 and 1910, the Randlords consolidated their political control through multiple mechanisms. First, they captured the regulatory apparatus. The Chamber of Mines became the de facto government body overseeing mining operations. It set industry standards, negotiated labor contracts, and coordinated with government officials on policy. Mining executives rotated between chamber positions and government appointments, ensuring alignment. Second, they controlled infrastructure development. They convinced the British government to fund railway construction using taxpayer money, then ensured those railways primarily served mining districts. The state bore the cost. Mining companies captured the benefit. Third, they shaped the legal framework. They drafted mining legislation, property laws, and labor codes that British officials then enacted with minimal revision. The legal system wasn't impartial. It was designed by and for mining interests. Fourth, they managed information flow. They owned or influenced major newspapers, ensuring favorable coverage of mining industry positions. They funded pro-mining political organizations and suppressed labor organizing through both legal and extra-legal means. By 1906, they'd created a political economy entirely centered on gold extraction. Every government policy, every infrastructure investment, every legal framework served mining profitability. But here's the thing. This system required constant maintenance. African workers resisted through strikes and work slowdowns. Afrikaner politicians agitated for greater local control. British liberal politicians questioned whether such naked exploitation aligned with imperial values. The Randlords' response was to make their political control structural rather than personal. They created institutions that would outlast individual mining magnates and survive political changes. The most significant institution was the unified South African state itself. In 1910, the British government created the Union of South Africa, unifying the Cape Colony, Natal, the Transvaal, and the Orange Free State into a single self-governing dominion. This wasn't a natural political evolution. It was an engineered outcome. The Randlords had lobbied intensively for unification, recognizing that a single government would be easier to influence than 4 separate colonies. They helped draft the Constitution, ensuring it created a strong central government with minimal provincial autonomy. The Union's founding constitutions explicitly excluded black Africans from voting in the Transvaal and Orange Free State. The Cape Colony's limited franchise for black voters was protected but not expanded. Indian and colored populations faced similar restrictions. This wasn't accidental. The Randlords needed a government that served mining interests without being accountable to the population most affected by mining operations. Louis Botha became the Union's first prime minister. Botha was an Afrikaner general who'd fought against the British during the war. His appointment looked like reconciliation, former enemies working together for a new nation. But Botha's government continued policies favorable to mining interests. The mines continued operating under the same labor system, the same regulatory framework, the same political priorities. Why? Because Botha understood that South Africa's economy depended on gold exports. Alienating mining interests meant economic collapse. The Randlords had structured the system so that any government, British or Afrikaner, conservative or liberal, had to prioritize mining profitability or face economic disaster. This is what successful political capture looks like. Not obvious corruption or bribery, but creating structural dependency where the government has no viable choice except to serve your interests. By 1910, the Randlords had achieved something unprecedented. They'd converted natural resources into political power, then used that political power to maximize resource extraction, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of wealth and influence. The system would persist for decades. The political structures they created would evolve into apartheid. The labor controls they implemented would become the foundation for systematic racial oppression. The wealth inequality they engineered would define South African society for generations. But in 1910, as Union Day celebrations filled the streets and politicians gave speeches about unity and progress, the Randlords were simply calculating next quarter's gold output and projected profits. They'd won, completely. The numbers were staggering even by Randlord standards. Between 1899 and 1914, the Witwatersrand gold mines produced 135 million ounces of gold. At contemporary prices, that represented approximately £570 million, equivalent to $70 billion today. The Randlords, controlling over 80% of production, captured roughly $56 billion in revenue during this 15-year period. But revenue wasn't profit. The true measure of their success was the extraordinary margins they achieved through the political control they'd established during and after the Boer War. Let me break down how war transformed their business model from profitable to obscenely lucrative. Before the war, labor costs represented approximately 45% of operating expenses. African miners earned between £3 and £4 per month, low wages but still high enough to constrain profit margins. White miners earned 15 to 20 per month for supervisory roles. After the war, the Randlords implemented a systematic campaign to reduce labor costs while increasing production. The campaign operated on multiple fronts simultaneously. First, they imported Chinese indentured laborers between 1904 and 1907. Over 63,000 Chinese workers were brought to South Africa under contracts that made chattel slavery look generous. The workers signed 5-year contracts in China without understanding the conditions. They received £3 per month, the same as African workers, but with no ability to change employers or negotiate terms. They were housed in compounds surrounded by barbed wire. They couldn't leave mining property without special passes. Desertion was criminalized. The stated justification was labor shortage. The real reason was wage suppression. By flooding the labor market with workers who couldn't negotiate and couldn't leave, the Randlords eliminated any bargaining power African miners might have developed. Second, they mechanized extraction processes to reduce dependence on skilled labor. Before the war, skilled miners controlled critical parts of the extraction process: drilling, blasting, timbering, giving them leverage to demand higher wages. After the war, the Randlords invested heavily in machinery that de-skilled these operations. Power drills replaced hand drilling. Mechanized hoisting replaced manual lifting. Standardized blasting protocols replaced skilled judgment. Each innovation reduced the number of skilled workers needed and increased management's control over the production process. By 1910, labor costs had dropped to 32% of operating expenses, while production per worker had increased by 40%. This represented a massive transfer of value from workers to mine owners. Third, they restructured the compound system to maximize labor extraction. Compounds weren't just housing, they were total control mechanisms. Workers entering compounds surrendered all personal freedom for the contract duration. The compounds operated on military-style discipline: wake-up calls at 4:30 a.m., mandatory work shifts, limited food rations calculated to minimum caloric requirements, no alcohol, no visitors, minimal medical care. Workers who resisted faced immediate dismissal and criminal prosecution under past laws. The goal was to eliminate anything that might reduce working hours or productivity. Rest, recreation, family connections, personal autonomy, all were viewed as inefficiencies to minimize. Here's what made this system particularly insidious. The Randlords justified compounds as protecting African workers from the corrupting influences of urban life. They claimed to be providing structure, discipline, and moral guidance to workers who supposedly couldn't manage their own affairs. This paternalistic rhetoric disguised pure economic calculation. Compounds reduced labor costs by preventing workers from accessing alternative employment, organizing collective action, or demanding higher wages. The moral justification was simply branding for a control system designed to maximize profit. By 1912, over 200,000 African workers lived in mining compounds across the Rand. The system had become so refined that mining companies could predict labor costs per ounce of gold extracted within 0.5% accuracy. But labor cost reduction was only one dimension of their profit expansion. The other was eliminating regulatory costs through captured governance. Before the war, Kruger's government had imposed various fees and taxes: mining licenses, ore export duties, dynamite monopoly prices, railway charges. These regulations reduced profit margins by approximately 15%. After the war, The British colonial administration and later the Union government systematically eliminated these costs. The dynamite monopoly was abolished immediately, reducing explosive costs by 40%. Railway rates were restructured to favor ore transportation over other freight. Mining license fees were reduced and fixed at rates that didn't adjust for inflation or gold price increases. Export duties were eliminated entirely. Most significantly, the Chamber of Mines negotiated a deal where mining companies paid extremely low royalties on gold extracted. The standard rate was 5% of gross profit, but gross profit was calculated after deducting all operating expenses, including generous allowances for equipment depreciation, executive salaries, and reinvestment. In practice, many mining operations paid effective royalty rates below 2%. On $56 billion in revenue, this represented a tax savings of approximately $8 billion compared to normal resource extraction royalties. The government justified these favorable terms as necessary to attract investment and develop the economy. The reality was that the Randlords had written the tax code themselves through their representatives on the Legislative Council and Chamber of Mines. Let me give you a specific example of how this worked. The Robinson Deep Mine, controlled by Rhodes's Consolidated Gold Fields, produced approximately 2 million ounces of gold between 1904 and 1914. At contemporary prices, this was worth roughly $8.5 million, $1.04 billion today. Operating expenses legitimately calculated were approximately £3.1 million. This left $5.4 million in profit. At a normal 10% royalty rate, the mine should have paid £850,000 in government fees. The actual amount paid was £180,000. The difference, $670,082 million today, went directly to shareholders instead of public revenue. Multiply this across dozens of major mining operations over 15 years, and you start to understand the scale of wealth transfer from public resources to private fortunes. But here's what's interesting. The Randlords didn't pocket all this wealth as personal income. They reinvested aggressively in expanding and consolidating their empires. Between 1902 and 1914, they used their extraordinary profits to acquire remaining independent mines. Any mining operation that remained outside Randlord control was systematically targeted for acquisition. They'd use their access to cheap capital from London financial markets to offer prices independent mines couldn't refuse. Between 1902 and 1910, the number of independent mining companies dropped from over 200 to fewer than 30. Vertical integration. They bought explosives manufacturers, steel suppliers, engineering firms, electrical companies, and equipment manufacturers. By controlling every input, they eliminated external profit-taking and captured value at every stage. Infrastructure development. They built railways, power plants, and water systems that served mining operations first and other users second. The infrastructure ostensibly belonged to the government, but was designed and often financed by mining interests, ensuring it met their needs. Financial diversification. They established banks, insurance companies, and investment firms. This allowed them to profit not just from mining operations, but from financing other people's mining operations. They became creditors as well as producers. International expansion. They replicated their South African model in other African colonies. British South Africa Company operations in Rhodesia, Anglo-American Corporation ventures in Zambia, and various concessions in West Africa all followed the template. Monopolistic consolidation, captured regulation, and cheap labor extracted through legal coercion. By 1914, the Randlords controlled more than just South African gold. They controlled significant portions of global diamond production, De Beers, 90 pals, global gold production, Rand Mines, 40 pals, Southern African copper production, 60 Southern African platinum production, 75 railway networks across Southern and Central Africa, major banks operating across Africa. The wealth concentration was extraordinary. Rhodes died in 1902, leaving an estate worth approximately £6 million, £730 million today. Beit died in 1906, leaving £8 million. Wernher died in 1912 with a fortune exceeding £10 million. Barnato had died earlier in 1897 under mysterious circumstances, potentially suicide, but his brothers continued the business. These weren't just rich individuals, they'd created dynasties. Their companies would continue operating for decades, eventually evolving into Anglo-American Corporation, De Beers Consolidated, and various other corporate entities that remain dominant in African resource extraction today. But wealth was only part of their legacy. The political and social structures they created would shape South Africa for the next century. The system of labor control they implemented became the template for apartheid's past laws. The residential segregation compounds evolved into urban townships. The racial wage gap they institutionalized persisted through generations. The political exclusion of black Africans they engineered lasted until 1994. You see, the Randlords didn't just extract gold. They constructed an entire political economy designed to extract maximum value while minimizing costs, primarily by denying rights and humanity to the people doing the actual work. The tragedy is that this system was preventable. Alternative models existed. Some mining companies in other regions operated with labor protections, reasonable wages, and worker participation in profits. Those models were less profitable but more sustainable and ethical. The Randlords rejected those models deliberately. They calculated that maximum profit required maximum control, and maximum control required eliminating workers' rights, political voice, and economic leverage. Their success proved that ruthless exploitation could be extraordinarily profitable if you controlled the political system that was supposed to regulate your operations. This lesson wouldn't be forgotten by future generations of resource extraction companies. The Boer War killed over 70,000 people. The mining system the Randlords implemented afterward killed many more through industrial accidents, disease, and poverty. Between 1904 and 1914, over 12,000 miners died in documented mine accidents. Actual deaths, including those from silicosis, tuberculosis, and other mining-related diseases, were likely 3 to 5 times higher. These weren't random tragedies. They were predictable consequences of a system that prioritized profit over safety, production over human life. In 1914, as World War I began in Europe, South African gold production reached 9.5 million ounces annually. The Rand was producing over 40% of the world's gold supply. The mining industry employed over 350,000 workers. The Randlords and their corporate successors controlled wealth equivalent to several $100 billion in contemporary terms. They'd achieved exactly what they'd set out to do 47 years earlier, when the first diamond was found near the Orange River. They'd built an empire on African minerals, enforced through British imperial power, and protected by political structures they'd designed themselves. The empire was complete. The question was whether it could be sustained. Johannes Kumalo was 19 years old when recruiters arrived at his village in 1906. The men wore European clothes and spoke several African languages. They explained that gold mines in Johannesburg were hiring workers for good wages. 6 months of work would earn enough money to pay colonial taxes, buy cattle, and support an extended family. The mines provided housing, food, and transportation. What the recruiters didn't mention was that Johannes would never leave the mine compound for the entire 6-month contract, that his housing would be a concrete bunk in a room shared with 40 other men, that the food would be mealy porridge twice daily, barely sufficient to maintain working strength, that his wages would be paid in company scrip only redeemable at company stores charging inflated prices. Johannes signed a contract he couldn't read, was given a travel pass, and joined a group of 200 men on a 3-week journey to Johannesburg. His story was repeated 200,000 times across southern and central Africa during the early 1900s. The Randlords' empire depended on a constant flow of African labor willing, or forced, to work in conditions that would be illegal anywhere in the industrialized world. Let me walk you through exactly how this system operated, because understanding the mechanics reveals how systematic and deliberate the exploitation was. The recruitment system the Randlords couldn't simply advertise for workers and hope people showed up. African communities had their own economies, agricultural cycles, and social structures. Working in distant mines for wages that barely covered basic needs wasn't naturally attractive. So the mining companies created artificial need through 3 mechanisms. First, They lobbied for taxation policies that forced participation in the wage economy. The British colonial administration implemented hut taxes and poll taxes that required cash payment. African communities using traditional barter economies suddenly needed currency. The only way to get currency was wage labor. The only major wage labor employer was the mines. Second, they restricted African land ownership through legislation like the 1913 Natives Land Act, which reserved 87% of South African land for white ownership. African families who'd farmed their own land for generations were suddenly classified as squatters on white-owned property. Their choices were work as farm laborers for minimal wages, move to urban areas where jobs were scarce and controlled by pass laws, or sign mine contracts. Third, they established recruiting organizations that operated across southern Africa. The Witwatersrand Native Labour Association, WENALA, controlled by the Chamber of Mines, sent recruiters into Portuguese Mozambique, British Rhodesia, Nyasaland, and other territories. Recruiters received bonuses for each worker signed, creating incentive for deceptive recruitment practices. The recruitment pitch emphasized temporary work with good pay. The reality was debt bondage. Workers had to pay for transportation, government-issued passes, and mandatory equipment fees that were deducted from wages before they even started working. Many workers arrived at the mines already in debt to the company. The compound system. When Johannes arrived at the Robinson Deep mine in 1906, he was processed like inventory. He was stripped, examined by a mine doctor who checked for obvious diseases and physical fitness, then issued a number. Not a name, a number. His personal belongings were confiscated for safekeeping. He was given mine-issued clothing, a metal identification badge, and assigned to Compound 4, Room 17, Bunk 23. The compound was surrounded by a 10-foot fence topped with barbed wire. A single gate was controlled by company police. Workers couldn't leave without special passes issued only for medical emergencies or contract completion. Visitors weren't permitted. Mail was monitored. Any worker caught outside the compound without authorization faced immediate arrest. Inside the compound, every aspect of life was regimented. Wake-up call at 4:30 a.m. Mandatory formation at 5 a.m. March to the mine shaft by 5:30 a.m. Work until 6 p.m. with a 30-minute break. Return to compound by 7 p.m. Mandatory lights out at 9 p.m. The compounds housed 3,000–5,000 workers each. Rooms contained 40–50 bunks stacked 3 high with less than 2 feet between them. No privacy, no personal space, no dignity. Sanitation was minimal. Communal toilets overflowed regularly. Water for washing was limited to 15 minutes daily. Diseases spread rapidly in these conditions. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and dysentery killed hundreds of workers annually in each compound. The mining companies viewed these deaths as acceptable costs. Workers who became too ill to work were dismissed and sent home without compensation. Their recruitment deposits weren't refunded. Dead workers' families received no death benefits. You see, the compounds weren't designed for human welfare. They were designed for maximum labor extraction at minimum cost. Every feature served this purpose. The isolation prevented workers from organizing collective action. You can't form a union when you can't meet workers from other compounds, can't communicate freely, and face deportation for agitation. The regimentation eliminated any time that might be used for anything other than work and minimal rest. If workers had free time, they might think about their conditions, question their treatment, or develop solidarity. The dehumanization made it easier for supervisors and managers to treat workers as interchangeable units. When you strip someone of their name, their belongings, their connections to family and community, it becomes psychologically easier to view them as resources rather than people. The work itself, underground mining in the early 1900s, was extraordinarily dangerous. The Rand's gold was buried in narrow reefs 3,000 to 6,000 feet underground. Extracting it required drilling into hard rock, placing dynamite charges, blasting, then removing broken rock before repeating the process. The work was done in stifling heat, often exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with minimal ventilation. Rock dust filled the air. The narrow working faces meant miners worked bent over or lying on their sides for entire shifts. African miners did the hardest, most dangerous work. drilling into rock faces, shoveling broken ore, pushing trolleys through narrow tunnels. White miners worked as supervisors, overseeing groups of 20–30 African workers. The racial division wasn't about skill. Many African miners became highly skilled at their work. It was about maintaining wage differentials. White miners earned 15 to 20 per month for supervisory work. African miners earned 2 to 3 per month for the actual mining. This wage gap was enforced through both informal practice and formal legislation. The 1911 Mines and Works Act, nicknamed the Color Bar, legally restricted certain skilled mining positions to whites only. Even when African miners demonstrated identical skills, they couldn't be promoted to positions that would require paying them white wages. The safety conditions were appalling. Between 1904 and 1914, over 12,000 miners died in documented accidents. The actual death toll was likely 40,000–50,000, when including undocumented deaths and those from disease. The most common fatal accident was rock falls. Inadequate timbering, rush drilling, and pressure to maximize production meant tunnels frequently collapsed. Rescue operations were minimal. If you were trapped, you likely died underground. The second most common cause of death was explosives accidents. Miners worked with dynamite daily under intense time pressure. Misfires, premature detonations, and improper blasting killed hundreds annually. But the largest long-term killer was silicosis, a lung disease caused by inhaling rock dust. The fine particles from drilling and blasting would embed in lung tissue, causing progressive breathing difficulty and eventual death. Mining companies knew about silicosis. Medical literature from the 1890s documented the condition. But implementing proper ventilation, wet drilling, which suppressed dust, and protective equipment would have increased costs and reduced productivity. So they didn't. They let miners breathe rock dust for 12-hour shifts, knowing it would kill them within 10 to 15 years of starting mine work. When miners developed silicosis symptoms, persistent coughing, breathing difficulty, weakness, they were simply dismissed and sent home. No compensation, no medical care, no acknowledgement that the company had destroyed their health. The mining companies calculated that this was more profitable than preventing the disease. A dead miner could be replaced with a healthy recruit for minimal cost. Installing ventilation systems and safety equipment was expensive and permanent. Look, this wasn't ignorance or unfortunate circumstance. This was calculated corporate policy. Internal company documents from this period explicitly discussed the trade-offs between safety expenditures and profit margins. They chose profit. The strike of 1913 by 1913, white miners, the relatively privileged supervisory class, were becoming increasingly frustrated with working conditions and management practices. They weren't concerned about African workers' treatment. They worried that mining companies were trying to reduce white wages by gradually replacing white workers with cheaper African labor. In June 1913, white miners at several Rand mines went on strike demanding wage increases and protections against job displacement. The mining companies refused to negotiate. The Chamber of Mines' position was clear. We control wages, you work for what we offer, or you're dismissed. The strike escalated. Over 20,000 white miners walked off the job. Mining operations ground to a halt. The Randlords, through their control of the Chamber of Mines and their influence in government, demanded military intervention. The government deployed troops. Confrontations between strikers and soldiers turned violent. Artillery was used against miner positions. Over 30 people died in clashes. The strike collapsed. Union leaders were arrested and deported. The mining companies offered minimal wage concessions while strengthening their control over labor organization. Here's what's significant about the 1913 strike. It proved that even relatively privileged workers had no real power against the Randlords' political economic machine. White miners had voting rights, public support, and organizational resources. They still lost. African miners had none of these advantages. Their strikes, which occurred regularly but received minimal historical documentation, were crushed immediately and brutally. Striking African miners were arrested en masse, imprisoned under pass law violations, then blacklisted from future mine employment. The 1913 strike taught the Randlords an important lesson. Even the appearance of labor organization was dangerous. After 1913, they implemented even more restrictive controls on worker organizing, surveillance of labor activists, and coordination with government authorities to suppress any collective action. The health catastrophe. By 1914, the health consequences of the Randlords' labor system were becoming undeniable. Tuberculosis rates among African miners were 20 times higher than the general population. Silicosis affected over 30% of miners who worked underground for more than 5 years. Industrial accidents continued killing 2,000–3,000 workers annually. But these statistics only counted deaths that occurred at the mines. Miners who became sick were sent home, where they died without being counted in mine fatality statistics. The true death toll was systematically undercounted. Missionaries and early public health researchers began documenting the catastrophe. A 1912 report by the South African Institute for Medical Research concluded that current mining practices were causing a public health disaster. The report recommended mandatory safety improvements, health screening, compensation for occupational diseases, and limits on working hours. The mining companies rejected all recommendations as economically unfeasible. They argued that implementing suggested safety measures would reduce profitability to the point where mines would close, costing jobs and harming the economy. This was, of course, nonsense. The mines were extraordinarily profitable. Implementing comprehensive safety measures would have reduced profit margins from 35% to perhaps 28%, still exceptionally high by any industry standard. But the Randlords had built their empire on maximum extraction and minimum costs. Any reduction in profit margins was unacceptable, regardless of human cost. The government, controlled by mining interests through various direct and indirect mechanisms, declined to enforce stricter safety regulations. The recommendations were filed away and forgotten. The legacy of labor exploitation. What the Randlords created wasn't just a mining system. It was a template for labor exploitation that would persist for decades. The compound system they developed became the model for migrant labor across South Africa. The pass laws they implemented to control worker movement evolved into apartheid's internal passport system. The racial wage gap they enforced became institutionalized policy. The denial of labor rights they practiced became standard. Every element of apartheid's labor control system, compounds, passes, influx control, job reservation, originated in the Randlords' mines between 1890 and 1914. They'd discovered that systematic exploitation could be extraordinarily profitable if you controlled both the economic system and the political structure that was supposed to regulate it. They'd proven that you could treat human beings as disposable resources and face no meaningful consequences as long as your victims lacked political power. The lesson wasn't lost on future South African governments. If it worked for the mining companies, it could work as national policy. By 1914, over 400,000 African workers were laboring in conditions that violated basic human dignity. They were housed in compounds, paid subsistence wages, denied rights, subjected to disease and death, and then discarded when no longer useful. The gold they extracted made the Randlords some of the richest men in the world. The system that extracted it would poison South African society for the next 80 years. The photograph was taken in 1925 at a London banquet. Seated at the head table were aging titans of mining, finance, and industry. Julius Verneer's successor at Verneer, Beit & Company, sat 3 seats from the chairman of De Beers, directors of Anglo-American Corporation. The newest addition to the Randlord empire conversed with representatives from major British banks. These men controlled approximately $500 billion in contemporary wealth. But more significantly, they controlled the institutions that would shape Southern Africa's economic and political future for the next century. Cecil Rhodes had died in 1902, Barney Barnato in 1897, Alfred Beit in 1906. The original Randlords were mostly gone, but the system they'd created lived on, evolving and expanding into something larger than any individual architect had envisioned. Let me trace how their empire transformed from personal fortunes into institutional power that persists today. The corporate evolution. By 1920, the original mining companies had consolidated into 3 dominant corporations. De Beers Consolidated Mines, Anglo-American Corporation, and Johannesburg Consolidated Investment Company, JCI. De Beers controlled diamond production globally, not just South African diamonds from anywhere. They'd expanded the monopoly Rhodes established in Kimberley into a worldwide cartel. Through a combination of direct ownership, supply contracts, and strategic partnerships, De Beers controlled over 90% of rough diamond supply throughout the 20th century. The mechanism was simple but effective. De Beers bought virtually all diamonds produced worldwide, stockpiled them, and released supply gradually to maintain artificially high prices. Producers who tried to sell independently were undercut, bought out, or denied access to De Beers' distribution network. This price-fixing conspiracy operated openly for decades. It wasn't hidden or illegal. It was the explicit business model. De Beers marketed itself as the guarantor of diamond value, the institution that protected consumers from price volatility. In reality, they were manipulating global commodity markets on a scale that would make modern antitrust regulators apoplectic. But because diamond production was concentrated in regions with limited regulatory oversight, primarily Southern Africa, De Beers operated without meaningful constraint. Anglo-American Corporation, founded in 1917 by Ernest Oppenheimer, with capital from J.P. Morgan and other American investors, became even more significant. Anglo-American consolidated gold mining operations across South Africa, expanded into copper mining in Zambia and Zimbabwe, acquired platinum interests, and eventually absorbed De Beers. By the 1970s, Anglo-American controlled approximately 40% of shares traded on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. The company's market capitalization exceeded South Africa's GDP. It was, effectively, a parallel government with more economic power than many nations. JCI, controlled by the Barnato family interests after Barney Barnato's death, remained smaller but significant. It specialized in gold mining and property development around mining districts. These weren't just large companies. They were interlocking systems of corporate control. Anglo-American owned shares in De Beers. De Beers owned shares in Anglo-American. Both owned shares in hundreds of smaller mining, manufacturing, and financial companies. Directors sat on multiple boards. The same families, Oppenheimers, Rothschilds, and others, maintained control through elaborate trust structures and cross-shareholdings. You see, the Randlords had discovered that direct ownership was less important than structural control. They didn't need to own 100% of every company. Owning 30% while controlling the board of directors achieved the same result with less capital exposure. This corporate structure, elaborate cross-ownership and interlocking directorates, became the standard model for South African business. It made competition nearly impossible. Any new mining venture needed capital from Anglo-American's banks, equipment from Anglo-American suppliers, and workers recruited through Anglo-American's labor networks. You either joined the system or failed. Political integration, the Union of South Africa, created in 1910, developed an increasingly formal system of racial segregation that reached its full expression with apartheid after 1948. The relationship between apartheid and the mining industry's labor system wasn't coincidental. Apartheid institutionalized and expanded the racial controls the Randlords had implemented decades earlier. The Native Laws Amendment Act of 1952, for example, created influx control regulations that were nearly identical to the mining industry's pass laws from the 1890s. Africans couldn't enter urban areas without permits tied to employment. Employment was controlled by employers who could revoke work permits at will. The Group Areas Act of 1950, which enforced residential segregation, replicated the spatial separation that the mining compounds had established. The Bantu Education Act of 1953, which provided deliberately inferior education to African children, ensured a steady supply of workers who lacked alternatives to manual labor. The architects of apartheid drew explicitly on the mining industry's experience. Government reports from the 1950s reference mining compound systems as successful models for managing African populations. The terminology was sometimes identical: influx control, labor bureaus, migrant workers. Here's what made this particularly insidious. The mining companies could claim they weren't responsible for apartheid, They were just following government regulations. Meanwhile, government officials claimed they were just codifying what the private sector had established as practical necessity. In reality, there was no meaningful separation between mining industry interests and apartheid policy. The same networks of people, power and money flowed through both systems. Mining executives sat in parliament. Government officials joined mining company boards after retirement. Policy proposals moved seamlessly between boardrooms and government offices. The result was a political economy where systematic racial oppression wasn't an unfortunate side effect of development. It was the operating system itself. Between 1948 and 1990, apartheid provided the mining industry with legal controls on labor mobility that prevented workers from seeking better opportunities, artificially suppressed wages through job reservation and racial wage gaps, state-funded infrastructure that primarily served mining districts, police and military forces that suppressed labor organizing, educational systems that produced workers with limited alternatives. In exchange, the mining industry provided the apartheid government with foreign currency from gold exports that sustained the economy, tax revenue that funded the apartheid administrative state, technical expertise in managing large labor forces, political support from English-speaking white business interests. It was a symbiotic relationship between racial oppression and corporate profit, the wealth that remained. The wealth extracted from South African gold and diamonds during the Randlord era didn't circulate through the South African economy. It accumulated in London, New York, and other financial centers. The Oppenheimer family, who controlled Anglo-American and De Beers from the 1920s through the 2000s, built a fortune estimated at over $7 billion. The Rothschild family, early investors in Rhodes's ventures, maintained significant mining interests worth billions. Numerous other families and financial institutions built generational wealth on foundations laid during the Randlord era. Meanwhile, South Africa's Black African population, 80% of the country, remained systematically impoverished. By 1990, after a century of industrial mining, Black African per capita income was approximately $2,100 annually. White per capita income was $9,500. The wealth gap created by the Randlords' labor system had, if anything, widened over time. The townships surrounding Johannesburg, Soweto, Alexandra, Katlehong, were direct descendants of the mining compounds. Inadequate housing, minimal services, overcrowding and poverty were their defining characteristics. The only difference between townships and compounds was that workers could theoretically leave. In practice, past laws and employment requirements created similar constraints. Consider this: between 1886 and 1990, South African mines produced over 50,000 tons of gold. At average prices during this period, that represented approximately $1.5 trillion in revenue. The workers who extracted that gold, approximately 10 million individuals over this 104-year period, received an estimated $150 billion in total wages. That's 10%. 90% of the revenue went to mine owners, shareholders, and associated industries. This wasn't just economic inequality. It was systematic wealth transfer on a scale rarely seen in human history. An entire continent's mineral wealth was extracted by millions of workers who received minimal compensation, controlled by political systems designed to prevent them from negotiating better terms, with the profits accumulated by a small elite primarily located on other continents. The environmental legacy: the Randlords also left an environmental catastrophe. By 2020, the Witwatersrand gold fields contained over 6 billion tons of mine tailings, crushed rock left over after gold extraction. These tailings contain toxic heavy metals, residual cyanide, and radioactive materials. They leach into groundwater, contaminate rivers, and create toxic dust that affects surrounding communities. The mining companies responsible for creating these tailings largely avoided cleanup costs. When mines became unprofitable, they closed operations, declared bankruptcy, and walked away. The environmental damage remained. Similarly, the deep underground mining created massive networks of abandoned tunnels that are now flooding with acidic water. This acid mine drainage contains heavy metals and sulfuric acid. It's seeping into rivers, contaminating water supplies and requiring billions in remediation costs. Who pays for this cleanup? Not the mining companies that created the problem, not the shareholders who profited from the extraction. The South African government, meaning taxpayers, disproportionately the descendants of the workers who were exploited, is left managing environmental damage that will persist for centuries. The Randlords extracted the wealth, left the poison, and stuck future generations with the bill. The modern echoes today's resource extraction industry bears the unmistakable fingerprint of the Randlords' innovations. The strategy of vertical integration, controlling supply chains from extraction through processing and sale, is now standard in mining, oil, and other extractive industries. The tactic of regulatory capture, using wealth to influence government policy, is practiced by every major resource extraction company globally. The model of minimizing labor costs through limited worker rights, contract employment, and automation follows the template the Randlords established. The practice of externalizing costs, leaving environmental damage and social harm for communities and governments to manage, replicates what the Randlords did systematically. When oil companies fight environmental regulations, they're following the Randlords' playbook. When tech companies lobby against labor protections, they're using strategies pioneered in Kimberley and Johannesburg. When corporations structure operations to minimize taxes and maximize profit extraction from developing nations, they're implementing lessons learned during South Africa's mineral rush. The specific techniques have evolved. The underlying logic remains identical: maximize value extraction, minimize costs through political control, and leave the consequences for others to manage. The reckoning in 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections with universal suffrage. Nelson Mandela, who'd spent 27 years imprisoned by the apartheid government, became president. The mining industry's political control finally ended, but its economic control remained largely intact. Anglo-American, De Beers, and other mining companies negotiated deals with the new government that protected most of their interests while making modest concessions to black economic empowerment requirements. The companies argued, essentially, yes, the system was unjust, but dismantling our economic power will cause unemployment and economic collapse. Better to reform gradually while maintaining stability. This argument largely succeeded. The post-apartheid government implemented some reforms: minimum wages, labor rights, health and safety regulations, but the basic structure of the mining industry remained unchanged. The same companies still dominated. Profit continued flowing primarily to shareholders rather than workers or communities. Between 1994 and 2020, South Africa's Black African population made significant social gains: access to education, political representation, legal rights. But economic transformation lagged far behind. The wealth gap between racial groups narrowed only slightly. Why? Because the economic institutions created during the Randlord era proved extraordinarily resistant to change. Decades of accumulated capital, political connections, and structural power couldn't be dismantled quickly or easily. The mines established between 1867 and 1914 still operate today, under different names and ownership structures, but following similar patterns. The wealth they generate still flows primarily out of Africa to financial centers abroad. The workers are still predominantly black African men, still underpaid relative to the value they create, still subjected to dangerous conditions. The system has been reformed. It hasn't been transformed. The question that remains: when you step back and look at the full picture, a question emerges that has no comfortable answer. How much of the modern global economy was built on systems like the Randlords created? The British Empire's dominance during the late 19th and early 20th centuries depended partially on capital flows from South African gold. London's position as a global financial centre was sustained by profits from African resource extraction. British industrial development was financed by wealth extracted from colonized territories. American economic power in the 20th century similarly depended on resource extraction: oil, minerals, agricultural products, from regions where local populations had limited political power and received minimal compensation. The comfortable myth is that developed nations became wealthy through innovation, hard work, and superior systems. The uncomfortable reality is that much of that wealth originated in systematic extraction from regions where people lacked the power to prevent it. The Randlords weren't aberrations. They were exemplars of a system that made fortunes by converting other people's resources, land, and labor into private wealth through political control and legal manipulation. Their story matters not because it's unique, but because it's typical. Every time we examine how concentrated wealth was created, we find similar patterns. Resource access controlled by small elites, labor costs minimized through legal coercion, political systems captured to serve economic interests, and profits accumulated far from the places where value was created. The Randlords perfected this system in South Africa, but they didn't invent it, and it didn't end with them. It's still operating today, in somewhat refined forms, in resource extraction industries worldwide. That's their real legacy. Not the mansions, not the art collections, not the scholarships and foundations established with their wealth. The legacy is the template they created for converting human suffering and resource depletion into shareholder value. Whether we like it or not, we're still living in a world shaped by the choices 7 men made in the red dust of Kimberley and the rocky hills of Johannesburg over a century ago. So we've seen how 7 individuals transformed from nobodies into architects of a system that controlled the economic fate of an entire continent. They arrived in South Africa with nothing but ambition and ruthlessness. They recognized that in a place where laws were weak and resources were abundant, anyone willing to act without ethical constraint could accumulate extraordinary power. They understood something fundamental about wealth creation that we're still grappling with. Control matters more than ownership, systems matter more than individuals, and political power is the ultimate multiplier of economic advantage. Today, over 150 years after the first diamond was discovered near the Orange River, South Africa remains one of the most economically unequal societies on Earth. The wealth gap between racial groups, the concentration of economic power in a few large corporations, the challenges of unemployment and poverty, all have direct connections to structures established during the Randlord era. The mines they opened are still operating. Some of the companies they founded still exist, often under different names but with traceable lineage to the original consolidations. Anglo-American, though restructured and partially divested, remains a major force in global mining. De Beers, though its monopoly has weakened, still dominates diamond markets. But their institutional legacy extends far beyond specific companies. The model they created, resource extraction through political control and labor exploitation, has been replicated worldwide. When you hear about coltan mining in the Congo, lithium extraction in South America, or oil operations in West Africa, you're often witnessing updated versions of systems the Randlords pioneered. The techniques are more sophisticated now. Modern corporations use complex financial engineering rather than crude monopoly. They operate through elaborate corporate structures that obscure ownership and accountability. They employ public relations firms and lobbyists rather than relying on colonial governors. But the core logic remains identical. Maximize extraction of valuable resources from regions where local populations lack political power to prevent it. Minimize costs through limited labor rights and environmental regulations, accumulate profits in financial centers far from extraction sites, and leave the long-term consequences for others to manage. Here's what's interesting about the Randlord story. They didn't hide what they were doing. Cecil Rhodes openly stated his goal of British dominance from Cape to Cairo. Alfred Beit published letters explaining that mining interests should control government policy. They believed their actions were not just justified but admirable, bringing civilization and development to Africa through capitalist enterprise. This confidence came from a worldview where European domination was natural, African lives had minimal value, and the accumulation of wealth by superior individuals benefited society overall. These beliefs were widely shared among their contemporaries, and supported by intellectual frameworks that portrayed racial hierarchy and capitalist exploitation as natural laws. We've largely rejected these explicit justifications. Modern resource extraction companies don't openly embrace racial superiority or claim the right to exploit workers because of ethnic identity. They speak instead of development, job creation, and mutual benefit. But when you examine actual practices, wage levels, environmental standards, profit distribution, political influence, the patterns remain troublingly similar to what the Randlords established. The real lesson here isn't that the Randlords were uniquely evil. They were products of their time, operating within legal frameworks that permitted and even encouraged their behavior. The lesson is about systems. They created institutional structures designed to concentrate wealth and power while limiting accountability. Those structures, once established, proved extraordinarily difficult to dismantle. Even after apartheid ended, even after democratic governance was established, even after explicit racial discrimination became illegal, the economic patterns persisted. Why? Because changing laws doesn't automatically change economic structures built over decades. Accumulated capital creates compounding advantages. Political connections endure across generations. Corporate structures can adapt to new regulations while maintaining core functions. Dismantling exploitative systems requires more than moral condemnation. It requires understanding how those systems operate, who benefits from them, and what mechanisms perpetuate them across time. The Randlords succeeded not primarily through violence, though violence was certainly used, but through creating self-reinforcing economic and political structures. They made their system seem necessary, inevitable, and ultimately beneficial even to many who suffered under it. That's sophisticated power, and it's still deployed today by corporations, governments, and individuals who've learned the same lessons. So the question remains, what do we do with this knowledge? We can't undo the past. The wealth was extracted, the systems were built, the damage was done. Millions of people labored and died, families were destroyed, communities were displaced, environments were poisoned. That can't be reversed. But we can recognize that patterns established during the Randlord era continue operating today. We can identify when resource extraction operates primarily for external benefit rather than local development. We can question whether current labor practices differ meaningfully from historical exploitation. We can examine whether environmental costs are being externalized onto communities with limited political power. And we can ask, are we comfortable with an economic system that produces extreme wealth through methods we'd condemn if they were described honestly? Because that's ultimately what the Randlords' story forces us to confront. They didn't steal South Africa's gold through masks and guns. They restructured an entire society to make the extraction legal, systematic, and permanent. They didn't exploit workers through obvious brutality, though brutality occurred. They created economic conditions where people had no choice but to accept exploitative terms. The gold is gone. The diamonds are gone. The minerals that took millions of years to form were extracted in decades and transformed into jewelry, currency reserves, and private fortunes. What remains is the question of whether we'll recognize these patterns when they appear in contemporary forms, or whether future generations will look back at our era with the same discomfort we feel examining the Randlords' legacy.